Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the tourism forecast for Australia. Thank you so much for joining us. I can see there are still more people joining, and that's okay, but we will get started. Please note that this session is being recorded, so we will have a recording available if anybody requires that afterwards. So my name is Corinne Rose. I'm from Tourism Research Australia. I'll be presenting to you today, and I will be joined by my colleague, Garrett Tyler Parker, who is the Director of the Data Analysis and Insights team here at TRA. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we are joining from many and varied lands across Australia and possibly beyond. I'm coming to you from Quandamooka country in southeast Queensland. It's beautiful coastal country on a stunning day. I thank the traditional owners of this land for their commitment and care to the lands and waters that I'm so proud to live on and raise my family on. And I extend that appreciation and respect to all First Nations elders and to any First Nations people joining us today. And I know Garrett is joining you from Ngunnawal country. I also want to acknowledge that today is a National Day of Mourning in Australia to honour the victims and all those affected by the Bondi Beach terrorist attack in December last year. This is a significant event that has had a profound impact on many, and I extend my heartfelt sympathies to all as we use this day to pause, to remember, and to reflect. Today's presentation will start with an overview, including why we forecast, and then I will outline how we forecast. I'll then cover the main takeaways from the international forecast and the scenarios we produced for international tourism before handing over to my colleague Garrett to take over and take you through the main takeaways from domestic forecasts and the scenarios we produced for domestic tourism. He will also make some closing remarks and open up for questions. So for questions, can you please open the Slido app? Hopefully you've used this platform before, so the link is there, slido.com, and Garrett's put it in the chat. You can also scan the QR code, but through this platform you can type in your questions. Everybody can see the questions that are being typed and can also vote for questions that are most interesting, so that when we get to question time, those questions that are most pertinent will be at the top of the list and we can get to them first. So as an intro, as I said, we're from Tourism Research Australia. So Tourism Research Australia produces the official tourism statistics for Australia and research on the visitor economy for the Australian government. We sit within the Office of Tourism and the Visitor Economy here at Austrade, and our team's role is to use data analysis and insights to better equip industry and government with the data and insights they need to strengthen marketing, business decisions and strategies. Each year, TRA produces forecasts, and these forecasts assist the industry and government and planners to make various decisions about including where to invest and the like, and how to make the most of the forecast trends that we're seeing. This is a picture of the cover page of this year's forecast report, so you can find the report itself on our website via the QR code. You can also download the data values, so the actual forecast values are available for download, and we have an executive summary or infographic page. So that's all free on the website. I'm sure most of you have been to the website to register for this webinar, but that's where you'll find most of the information from today if you're looking for any further details. So our forecasting process. So for those who are familiar with our forecasting methodology from previous years, I can assure you that this year's methodology was largely unchanged. But for those less familiar, I can take you through an overview, which is that TRA's forecasting methodology is a hybrid. It blends both quantitative analysis with expert judgments. So on the quantitative side, we conduct a lot of detailed data analysis. We use TRA's internal data sources, as well as ABS arrivals data, various other published data sources, as you can see here. We often disaggregate this data and conduct database modeling. but we also use other sources to get a broader range of inputs, and we can apply judgments from various sources to account for these broad range of factors. So we get substantial input from a panel of tourism forecasting experts, and our forecasting panel includes experts from various visitor economy sectors, including aviation and business events. It also includes government representatives, we have economic and industry forecasters and consultants, and also academics. So this is quite a unique aspect of the TRA forecasts, and it allows us to tap into our networks to ensure our analysis is aligning with what's being observed throughout industry. We iteratively update our forecasts over several months, and we consult widely to ensure that our forecasts are comprehensive and robust. So in terms of the key drivers and the risk factors that we saw this year, so there are many and varied, but the most influential factors that we identified, some of those are shown here. So they cover off various sectors. So we got economic risks. We also have supply side and connectivity considerations. We consider travel preferences, as well as things like weather and the rate and spread of population growth. Four of the factors that we've found to have the largest influence this year compared to last year were global and domestic economic conditions, geopolitical stability, the relative costs of travel in Australia compared with overseas, and the positive impact of major events. Now, because there is variability in exactly how these things will pan out over the next 5 years, this year TRA published some forecast scenarios that show how our key tourism metrics could pan out if these factors evolve differently to our best guess central scenario. So we will touch on the findings from the scenarios after running through the key points from our central scenarios. So those are the factors, and this was the data prior to the forecasts. So this chart shows you total visitor spend in Australia. It breaks that down by the 3 visitor cohorts, so international travellers at the bottom in the dark purple, domestic day trips, and then domestic overnight trip spend in the copper bars at the top. So in 2024, total visitor spend reached around $181 billion, which was 5% higher than in the previous year. And that growth was driven largely by growth in international visitor spend. If you look back to 2019, the spend in 2024 is 45% higher than it was back then, and each of the components are higher in 2024 than they were in 2019. In particular, the domestic spend components were significantly up. This chart also shows that domestic visitor spend makes up the majority of total visitor spend in Australia, and that's more so the case now than it had been in the past. So the context with which we conducted this year's forecast was one where travel spend was very high after surging in recent years, but that the growth in spend, particularly domestic travel spend, had been slowing. We've also had a change in the data measurement to note, and that's affected the domestic data, and Garrett will talk to that later in the section, but that just reflects as we've changed our methodology from the NVS data over onto our new DOTS data. Garrett will explain that for you. So in summary, our forecast outlook. So this is an overall chart. The overall outlook is positive. It suggests growth going forward, growth in spend. We forecast an increase in total visitor spend in 2025 of about 6% in 2025. So that's slightly more than the previous year. And growth in 2025 is led by increased domestic day trip spend and international visitor spend. Meanwhile, spend by domestic overnight visitors is expected to decline slightly in 2025 as Australians opt for shorter trips and day trips. But over the full forecast horizon, we see annual average growth of 4%, and total visitor spend in the visitor economy reaching around 233 billion in 2030. And during that period, there is growth for all of the three components, and we see growth in domestic overnight spend that progressively strengthens over time, and that's reflecting a continued improvement in household financial positions. Meanwhile, the very strong growth in day trip spend this year is expected to taper over time. Just 2 points on the data while I'm here. So these spend values are in Australian dollar terms and they are in nominal values. And secondly, that the international spend component includes only spend in Australia, and it only includes those short-term visitors that we focus on. It excludes the long-stay international student cohort. Okay, so that is the summary, and I'll delve now into more detail on what's driving that outlook for international spend. And so this chart just shows you the bottom bars from the previous chart, just focusing on those. So international spend in Australia is forecast to increase by 15% in 2025. So that will see us go from an already record high 32.9 billion in 2024 to 37.7 billion in 2025. So that's pretty strong growth this year, and that reflects growth in arrivals from high spend cohorts, as well as a temporary boost from spending by visitors associated with the British and Irish Lions rugby tour. In addition, expanded eligibility requirements in previous years for working holiday visas led to an increase in tourism spend by working holiday makers. So they have a very long stay in Australia and contribute to the value of spend. Over the full forecast horizon, we forecast continued growth in international spend at an average annual rate of 4%. And that sees total, just the international spend in Australia reach 46 billion in 2030. The sort of slower pace of annual growth over the forecast horizon reflects a moderating inflation outlook and also the tapering in the growth of international visitor arrivals, which is what I will talk about now. So international visitor arrivals, this is numbers of people arriving, are forecast to grow from 8.3 million in 2024 up to 8.8 or 8.9 million in 2025, and then on to nearly 11 million in 2030. So that's 24% growth over the next 5 years, which is fairly substantial. That's an additional 2 million visitor arrivals over this period. And so growth over that 5-year period reflects things like continued gradual increases to aviation capacity, and that includes commencements of flights into Western Sydney's new international airport. There's also growth in inbound demand from a range of source markets, including those that had been slower to recover from the pandemic disruptions to travel, most notably China. It's a very large source market for Australia. We have multiple major international sporting events confirmed to be held in Australia over this period and beyond, which will attract international visitors to Australia. Australia's enduring reputation as a safe and clean and friendly and welcoming and aspirational travel destination. So these are particularly important in an uncertain global travel environment. The promotional work to grow markets and attract visitors to Australia, and also Australia's positive reputation, not just as a holiday destination, but also a destination that attracts business, employment, and education arrivals. By source market, so TRA forecasts arrivals from each of our 20 largest source markets. And this chart just shows you the annual average growth rate over the full forecast horizon in arrivals from that source market. So you can see that the market with the fastest growth outlook over the period is China, followed by Hong Kong. And we have quite a few Asian markets up there in the faster growing cohort, countries such as India, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. On the other hand, down the other side of the chart, you see some of our large and mature markets. And while they have slower annual growth rates, they still contribute strongly to the number of arrivals. And so that is shown more clearly in this next slide. So this chart shows our top 10 markets, top 10 largest source markets. So New Zealand is our largest source market. It is forecast to remain the largest source market over the full forecast horizon. And despite having the slowest growth rate, it is still expected to contribute more additional visitors to Australia over that period than any other market except for China. So it's still very significant. China is forecast to remain our second largest market. And as you can see, a very large increase in arrivals from China. So this has supported some of the factors I've already mentioned, but supported by rising aviation capacity in from China. We've had a recent memorandum of understanding on tourism with China, enhancements expected to the approved destination status scheme, additional policy stability relating to inbound international travelers, and positive economic and social ties. So there's positive factors there. The United States and the UK are forecast to remain Australia's third and fourth largest inbound markets. These two markets both bring a large share of high average spend travellers, making them very valuable markets for Australia. So while their large mature markets have slower annual average growth rates, they still provide a significant contribution both to the volume of travellers as well as the international spend or the value of international tourism in Australia. By purpose of travel, so our forecast suggests that arrivals for all main purposes of travel are likely to increase in 2025 and then trend higher through to 2030. Arrivals for the purpose of holiday account for the largest share of arrivals, and they are expected to grow slightly above the aggregate rate of growth, both in 2025 and over the full forecast horizon. And this sector receives a boost from the major sporting events held in Australia and also the strong demand for working holidays in Australia. Arrivals for the purpose of visiting friends and relatives, VFR, are forecast to surpass their previous peak in 2025 and then to continue trending higher. Meanwhile, growth in international business arrivals is expected to be slower than the other purposes, and the current forecast trajectory does not see business arrivals returning to the pre-pandemic peak level. This reflects headwinds such as global business and budget conditions, widespread access to technology that reduces the value proposition of some types of business travel, and additional sustainability reporting requirements, particularly with a long-haul flight into Australia typically involved. We also see, thanks to Australia's strong appeal as an education destination, that education arrivals are forecast to trend higher in line with the policies to support sustainable growth in this sector. And employment arrivals, so they're already at above their historical peak level. So the historical peak level was back in 2015. They're higher than that now, and they're expected to trend higher. And this is in line with the appeal of Australia for workers and for working holiday makers, and the growth and innovation of Australia's globally engaged companies. So this information, what I've shared so far, all comes from our central scenario. This reflects TRA's best view of the most likely outcomes for tourism metrics. However, as I said, there is a high level of uncertainty inherent in forecasting, particularly out this far. And so we have produced scenarios this year. Now, these scenarios are not meant to capture every potential outcome. They don't capture the case of extreme events, but they just focus on the realm of most likely outcomes, and they account for the variability in those forecast assumptions that I talked about over the next 5 years. So on this slide, a relatively simple chart, but I will talk about the factors behind the scenarios. Excuse me. So on the optimistic scenario, we see a de-escalation in global conflicts relative to the central scenario, with increased confidence that future conflicts can be avoided. Inbound aviation capacity grows more strongly and includes additional long-haul routes into high-value markets. The new Western Sydney Airport promotes additional inbound travel for a variety of travel purposes. Arrivals from China maintain a stronger growth trend, and more generally, there's a broader and stronger economic growth outlook, with growth in household incomes leading to additional discretionary spending. Meanwhile, on the pessimistic scenario, we see weaker economic outcomes for key growth markets, in part driven by trade tensions, leading to a shift to internal facing demand globally and lower growth in wages. There's an increase in the number and scale of natural disasters, and a larger impact from domestic and global policies to address sustainability, particularly related to the aviation sector, for example, through taxes or fees or higher airfares. We also see aviation capacity growth continuing to favour those outbound travel destinations, with fewer additional routes targeting inbound markets, as airlines continue to seek high margins. There's also an ongoing risk of global conflicts, particularly conflicts that lead to occasional impacts on travel routes, which weigh on travel sentiment. So under all three of these scenarios, Australia continues to face growth opportunities, but it can just capitalise on those to varying degrees. So we continue to see that the strong lineup of major sporting events. There's a lot of work already completed and underway to enhance the sustainability of Australia's tourism offerings. And Australia's visit economy still aligns with those global growth trends like sustainable travel, nature-based travel, experience travel, wellness travel, adventure travel, cultural tourism, agritourism, and the blended business leisure travel trends like work from anywhere and the digital nomads. But we do see the difference in the trend rate of arrivals over this period under the different scenarios. And with the scenarios, the way we've defined them, it's markets like China, followed by the US and the longer haul markets that seem to see the biggest fluctuation and variation across the scenarios. So the last thing I just wanted to show you before I hand over to Garrett is the outlook for international outbound travel by Australians. So we know Australians like to travel. There were 11.6 million overseas trips in 2024. Sorry, the number just fell off the chart, but it was 11.6 million. We forecast further growth in 2025 and continued growth, but at a moderating rate. Oops, sorry. Over the forecast horizon. So the high number and the ongoing growth in outbound trips, it's attributable to a few things. So strong outbound demand for holiday travel from Australians. So holiday travel makes up the majority of outbound trips. There are a range of affordable holiday destinations that are very available to Australians, with strong growth in aviation capacity servicing these destinations. So that includes Indonesia and Thailand, Vietnam, the Pacific Islands and the like. There's also strong demand for outbound VFR travel. Not surprising, we have a large share of our population who were born overseas or parents born overseas and generally have a higher likelihood of traveling overseas to visit friends and relatives. But nevertheless, our central forecasts suggest that the rate of growth in inbound arrivals will actually outpace outbound arrivals from 2026 onwards. And so this will see the gap between the outbound travel and the inbound travel, which we term net outbound travel. We'll see that stabilize at a high level. So that gap had jumped up in previous years and it sits above its historical average, but we see that stabilizing over the coming years. Now, it's important to note that this outlook for outbound travel is a key risk to the forecasts as well. It can affect both international and domestic tourism forecasts, and that's become evident in recent years with the strength of outbound travel having an impact on the pace of growth in the inbound arrivals, but also in domestic overnight travel. So earlier this year, for example, destinations like Japan had been very strong with lots of Australians visiting Japan, but the arrivals from Japan had been weaker, seemingly that Australian travellers are filling up the plane ahead of the international travellers. So that could be a consequence that's more obvious now in this post-pandemic environment of supply constraints and financial pressures for the airlines, but it's certainly something that we will continue to watch going forward. And so that is it from me on the international side, and I will hand over to Garrett to take you through the domestic forecast now.
Awesome. Thanks, Corinne. That's fabulous. I'll just say, I see one question there in the chat. Will the PowerPoint slides be shared? All this information and a lot more is in the forecast report on tra.gov.au. So I'd recommend you grab that. There's even data tables as well for those people who want to dig into it, and plenty more stuff on there too. Before getting into the domestic tourism forecasts, as Corinne alluded to, and as hopefully as many of you know, in 2025, we entered effectively a new era of domestic tourism statistics. So we launched DOTS, which is the Domestic Tourism Statistics, and this replaced the long-running National Visitor Survey, or NVS, as many as you would probably know it. DOTS is it's a world-leading approach to measuring official tourism statistics. It's bringing together survey responses with anonymized mobile device mobility data. And why we did this and what it gives us is significant. So we did it because it will now give us more robust data, more timely. It's actually more cost-effective than the NVS was going to be going forward, and more granular insights into domestic travel. So while the survey questions are pretty much all the same from the National Visitor Survey through to DOTS, as you can probably imagine, when we changed from the National Visitor Survey, which was classically a telephone survey, and then moved to an online survey, to this new mixed method approach of survey and mobility data, there's a bit of a change across that method. And so because these methods differ quite a bit, we don't recommend comparing DOTS results with historic NVS data, but to ensure that you can still look back and see what trends are happening across key metrics, we have done a backcast of DOTS data from 2019 through to 2024. So you can still be able to see how trends are going at some of those key high-level tourism metrics levels. And then going forward, it's yeah, we're all going to be getting into DOTS and having a lot more about that. Again, so much more information about that is available on the TRA website, but I just wanted to flag that because when you're looking at some of the metrics that we've got, we don't always show the backcast stuff at some of the more granular level now that we're playing with DOTS here too. Okay, next slide, please. So I've just got this one as a build. If you give me one more click, Corinne, just firstly looking at day trips. So this is forecast domestic day trips, number of millions of day trips, I should say as well. And as you can see there, it's pretty good growth from what we're seeing for the forecast day trips there. So as Corinne touched on, we forecast 2025 as well, because even though we're now in January, we don't have all the data yet for that. So quite a big jump up in 2025 and pretty steady growth throughout there. If we look at domestic overnight trips, though, we see it's not as strong, what we're seeing in terms of that level of growth there. So actually the forecast there for that domestic overnight trip level is, as you can see, pretty much steady for the first kind of wave, I suppose, 2025 going in there. And it kind of starts to grow over time, and then we see a bit more growth in some of the later years. So at a total level, Australians are still big fans of travel. I remember seeing a kind of trends or preferences study a while ago, and that travel has become much more of a must in the Australian lifestyle these days. So it will be budgeted for, it will happen, but how that plays out is obviously influenced by a lot of factors, particularly household budgets and economic factors playing in on that. What we're seeing in recent times is that there has been more day trips happening because it's a cheaper way to travel. People are choosing to travel closer to home, opting for shorter trips, and so that day trip kind of fits that pattern. But as we see the economic conditions kind of get better over time in Australia, we're seeing that the domestic overnight trips are going to tick up a little bit across there as well. On the next slide, though, we've got the spend. So again, firstly, looking at the day trip spend, it's quite, again, quite significant jump from 2024 through to 2025, and does mean that we're seeing good growth there as well. So pretty steady across the board in terms of that level of growth that we're seeing that kind of comes through there for the spend. And then when we look at domestic overnight spend, you can see it's significantly higher. So while the number of trips are less, obviously when you're traveling, as you would all know, when you stay overnight, you're spending significantly more money. I guess what's interesting, though, I suppose, from our side of forecasting and looking at the numbers of it, that we are seeing that decline in overnight spend into 2025, and then 2026 starting to pick up a bit, getting a bit higher, and then steady growth kind of going forward from there. Overall, if we look at domestic spend at a total level, the trend is up, with even that slight, it's $1 billion down in that trend to 2025, but it's overshadowed into the positive, I suppose, by the growth that we're seeing in the domestic day trip as well. And total domestic spend, as Corinne showed at the beginning, by 2030, total domestic spend is expected to reach $187 billion in 2030. Now, when we look at the nights that we're seeing for the domestic overnight trips, kind of fitting with what we're seeing, short trips equals less nights away. So not a big shock, I suppose, that in terms of what we've already outlined in the forecasts there. But for 2025, we're seeing that kind of just stay pretty steady. 2026, a little bit of an uptick, but still below that 2022 high, if you remember. Or maybe you don't want to remember, but when we couldn't actually travel overseas at all, but there was a lot of domestic travel during the pandemic, that was the high of domestic overnight trips and nights, sorry, I should say. But then that ratio of nights starts to increase over time. So the further we get out there, we're starting to see it's coming through a little bit more as well. And those domestic overnight number of nights, they're expected to see that higher trend go up as household financial pressures continue to ease, and growth in demand for outbound travel kind of moderates, as Corinne shared as well. So how does that shape up across Australia? This is all the states and territories, just showing here on the map the forecast number of domestic overnight trips in 2030. Now, so the number of millions of trips, and then the average year-on-year growth for every state and territory. And I think if you firstly just, cast your eye over the map, you can see that the percentage of variation across the 5 years, it's not huge. We're seeing lowest being 1.3% average across the next 5 years down in Tassie, the highest being 1.8% with Queensland, and WA, and everyone else falling in between that across that 5-year period. There's a myriad of factors that feed into this, and Corinne touched on some at the beginning, but in particular on the domestic side, there's the economic outlook, even projected population growth, composition of visitor markets for every state and territory, and a lot more going into that. Closer though to where we are now, looking specifically at 2026, our forecasts do see much greater variation just in what's going to happen between 2025 and 2026 for the domestic overnight trip market. So firstly, for Queensland, we're seeing the strongest growth there at 1.9%. It was hampered a little bit, as many of you would be aware and remember, by natural disasters in 2025. So that may have slowed things down, but Queensland still had quite a good year for 2025 as well. But that growth coming in at 1.9%. Then WA, NT, and New South Wales, all around that 1.3, 1.5% growth. ACT and Tassie, pretty clear on the 1% level of growth from 2025 to 2026. And Vic and South Australia just slightly below that at 0.8 to 0.9% growth as well. And again, there's a number of reasons why that varies across every state and territory. There's a bit more detail in the reports as well, which we can, you can jump into and dig into so you can see how that all plays out too. Onto though the why. So I suppose, why people travel, what drives it, and there's the top reason there is holiday for the domestic overnight visitor market. I guess firstly though, just pointing out all reasons for travel in terms of domestic overnight travelers. So holiday, VFR, business, and other, and I'll define what other means in a moment as well, all expected to go up. And you can see there, so back in, for the forecast in 2025, just looking at holiday there, 49.2 million trips for holiday. By 2030, that's forecast to reach 53.8 million trips, and it's going to be a 9% increase. Looking across all four, you can see that level of increase is pretty good, pretty consistent across all of them there. So a 9% increase for holiday, VFR, and other, and then 7, slightly less for business from 2025 to 2030. And while those numbers, 9%, do come through for the 3 of the 4 of them, each purpose of travel really shows its own trends and forecast pattern. And that is reflecting the changing behaviors that we're seeing, economic conditions, and preferences as well. So firstly, just touching on holiday a bit there, I mean, really it's reflecting, as I said before, that Australians' enduring enthusiasm for leisure travel. It's still there, it's still strong, and we're seeing that, Aussies love to explore their own country. So it remains the #1 reason for travel, for domestic overnight travel. Holiday growth rate is going to be marginally outpacing other travel purposes. Not so much in the earlier part of the forecast, so 25, 26, and kind of 27, but from 2028 onwards, we're seeing that the rate of holiday growth kind of picks up a bit. VFR, or visiting friends and relatives, is the second largest share of travel. Now, unsurprisingly, this is really characterized by that lower average spend because, typically if you're visiting friends and relatives, you often stay with them as well, share expenses, a bit more of a cost-effective way to travel. And tying back again to some of the points that Corinne made about why we're seeing some factors move and play in our forecasts as well, it makes sense that VFR travel is kind of doing pretty well. And we're also seeing at the moment for 2026 and into 2027 that the growth in VFR travel is forecast to outpace holiday for those first couple of years. Business, I think this has been a bit of a trend that we've seen post-pandemic in terms of the growth rates of business. We've certainly seen business continue to grow, and it will continue to grow, but that slower growth rate is what we're seeing. And several factors influence that. I don't think any of these are new now in 2026, but widespread adoption of online comms, and again, as Corinne already touched on as well, this growing focus on the environmental impact of travel from the business sector as well. So while we expect economic conditions to gradually improve overall, that growth in business travel is still going to grow, but slightly at a more modest rate. And then lastly, other. So this is just 6% of domestic overnight trips. So relatively small, but still accounts for 1 in 20 trips. This is things like medical appointments, education, funerals, employment, trips that are often non-discretionary, but not related to leisure and not related to business. And the growth rate of this is pretty steady across the forecast period as well. Now, jumping into the forecast scenarios. So similar to what we did for international, and without going over some of the points that Corinne made there, we've put together in the forecast report, as we do every year, the central forecast. So this is our best view of the most likely outcome for key tourism metrics. However, when we do this, we do obviously take into account so many different factors and look at these, and there is a high level of uncertainty in trying to literally predict the future, not only just here in Australia, but in the world, and how that's going to play out across tourism. So across those assumptions, we decided, okay, this time let's also publish what could be a bit more of a pessimistic scenario and what could be a bit more of an optimistic scenario, and outline some of the factors that are going to influence that as well. So we've done that for the domestic overnight market as well in terms of trips and spend. And just showing here the number of trips here. As you can see from the forecast there, it kind of goes out like a fan as you go over time. So closer to where we are now, we're a bit more certain, a bit more believable that the pessimistic and the central and optimistic will be a bit more aligned. But as we get further out, these variables can have a wider impact. And by the time we get out to 2030, that difference in number of trips is about 13 million between what we see the pessimistic and the optimistic forecasts there. Just on the spend side, again, this is in the full report. The central for domestic overnight spend is about 130 billion. Pessimistic is about 120, and optimistic is about 140 billion. So $20 billion range, depending on what could happen there. Just shown there on the side as well, some of the key factors that we're really seeing that influence these alternate forecasts. So again, we've touched on some of these, but within the context specifically around the domestic overnight travel market, that economic side, we're looking at, well, there could be stronger national economic jobs growth. I think employment figures just got released while we've been talking actually as well. So things like that all feed into this, while weaker economic conditions could constrain budgets and reduce overnight travel. Population growth, faster population growth, that's going to underpin high demand for domestic overnight trips. Slower population growth is going to actually limit overall travel volumes as well. And obviously that takes a bit of time to have an effect, but all these are factors that we take into account when we look at it. Aviation, we've touched on the international one, or Corinne talked a bit about that, but also just on the domestic side. So aviation capacity, competitiveness, travel costs around this. This is also influenced by other external factors too, like higher fuel prices, sustainable aviation fuel, these kind of things hitting that optimistic and the pessimistic side as well. And the last two there just being natural disasters. So this is a considerable factor for us to be taking into account in the domestic overnight tourism market, if we just consider what's also just been going on the last few weeks, as well as ongoing natural disasters as well that we're seeing. How many of these we have and how big the impact is. So looking at the frequency and severity of these natural disasters as well, and that influences those factors too. And lastly, the outbound travel. So Corinne again touched on this, but it's a really interesting one. We love to travel as Australians, and we're seeing that just happen more and more. And the international side is just, as we can see that the gap between the amount of Aussies going out and the amount of international coming in, it's been growing over time. So there, the reduced competition from strong outbound travel will support higher domestic overnight demand, while persistently strong outbound travel is going to divert Aussies away from potentially having a domestic overnight trip as well. So again, it's a key factor in there too. That kind of gives us a bit of a wrap of the domestic shape of things. So I'll give us a bit of a summary and then tell you a few things that we've got coming up in Tourism Research Australia. So if you just want to jump to the next slide, Corinne, I've got just here really just, you know, 4 key points to take away. If someone asks you, what was that webinar actually about? So overall, it's a positive outlook for the tourism forecast out till 2030. There's varying growth by location, by purpose, by traveler type, but the overall theme is one of positivity. How that splits out though. So 4 key points to take away. 1, as I just said, we're set for continuous growth. So we do see spend, visitation rising. Early on, it's going to be that strong international and day trip demand. Later on, a bit more domestic overnight spend coming back in as well. 2, international arrivals are going to be expanding significantly, looking to hit 11 million international arrivals by 2030. This is driven by increased aviation capacity, recovering Asian markets, especially China there, and Australia's positive reputation as well that we see as a destination. Domestic travel, it remains resilient, but outbound travel remains a factor. So we do love to travel, as I've touched on, and we're going to continue balancing that cost of living pressure by, in the short term, taking those shorter, closer to home trips. In the long term, we see greater overnight travel returning, but there is the outbound travel as that major swing factor there as well. So that's still, you know, that certainly sates the appetite for a trip as well. And the last one as well, this is a forecast out till 2030. We've got the central forecast. This is what we believe to be the most likely scenario over the next 5 years. But there are a number of conditions, and just really calling out the economic, aviation, natural disasters, outbound travel, they're all going to heavily influence some of these outcomes, which is why it's really good to have a look through the report and check out the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. Can really help with a bit of planning, strategy, and ideas, particularly in some areas. So do keep an eye out over the few coming months as well for numbers coming from TRA and from your local state and territory tourism officers as well, because they'll be, you know, telling you how well we're aligning with this and how things are looking to. And so just on that, I'll just briefly touch on just what we have in the next 3 months. So we've got there tra.gov.au and the QR code. Even if we just look at what's coming up in the next 3 months, so in February, we'll be releasing the tourism business counts in Australia. So that shows you the time series, how many tourism businesses there are, broken down by sectors, survivability of tourism businesses as well. In March, we're going to have the full year 2025 data for domestic tourism from DOTS and from the International Tourism International Visitor Survey. So that'd be great to have a full calendar year of data. Much good stuff to play with there. March will also see the release of the tourism labour force statistics, or number of jobs. It's a bit more common way of talking about that. And then following that, we have the state tourism satellite account, or state tourism economic data. For those who may have missed it, in December, the national tourism economic data was released. So noting that tourism accounts for 2.9% of Australia's GDP. In April, we've crunched the numbers and we'll be able to release what that is at a state level. So tourism's contribution to gross state product, exports and jobs as well. And last year, just calling out as well, we also released a whole series of market profiles for our top 20 international markets. We're going to be updating them all with the latest data to download from our website too. So plenty coming up, as well as our monthly updates to the visitor economy facts and figures, which is a lovely dashboard of all key information, and mobility movement data, which tells you at a monthly level what's going on in your area as well. So yeah, please do subscribe, to our newsletter so we can keep you all up to date on that, and check out the TRA website as well, because there's plenty going to be going on in 2026. And with that, I'll we'll probably jump over to Slido and see if we've got some questions coming in. So thanks all. I'll go to you, Corinne, if you've had a chance to check out Slido.
Yes, thanks, Garrett. So there are some questions in here, and I can read out the top question so far, which is about visitor economy statistics, including the outbound projections. Just a question about whether the figures there are underdone with very strong outbound figures so far in 2025 and 2026, and inbound data being very strong from China, even though we have 10 Chinese aircraft carriers serving our gateways. So that was the question, which is great. Thank you. I was going to say, Garrett, do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Roll.
Okay, so yes, thank you. Outbound has been very strong. We have seen strong growth into lots of destinations. We've noted that it can vary over the months through the year, so I can see there's some annualized statistics in there. So we did see in particular very strong outbound growth in the first half of the year that has come off a bit in the second half of the year. So we're just watching those trends, but it certainly plays a role in terms of how many people can fit on the plane, I think, the outbound versus the inbound figures. And with the 10 Chinese carriers, so that's great. That rising aviation capacity is certainly something that we're watching, and that's really good. But the composition of the people on the planes is also very important for our forecasts. So that is something that we watch, noting that even travelers, sort of travelers from China, they might not necessarily be captured in our short-term visitor arrival statistics if they're staying here for a while, or, if they're moving here, or if they're staying for long-term education or something along those lines. If they're on different visas, they'll get captured in different statistics. So we are sort of focusing on those very short-term, just the short-term visitors. So hopefully that helps, but thank you so much for the input. That carrier question is great. The next most popular question was, is there projected percentage growth rates by state for the international market forecasts? So unfortunately not at the moment, not this year. It's something that we hope that we can produce in time, but at the moment we have international forecasts at the national level, and we have only the domestic forecasts available at the state level. So you can get your domestic overnight trips and overnight trips by purpose at the state level. The third one here is, how much of a threat is outbound travel to domestic travel? Is there a balance we are striving for? Garrett, you were talking about that just now. Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. It's a threat is a funny word, I suppose, to pop in there, but I totally get what you mean. How much of a threat? I'd say how we look at it in the forecasting side is that, consideration of it as a factor and a variable. It is certainly a notable factor when we look at the domestic travel, so domestic overnight travel in particular. And I think anecdotally, we've all kind of heard from people about the choice between going on a, beach holiday somewhere versus heading over to Bali. And if it's for a week, then what's the cost impact of that, and what's the experience as well? So there's a number of factors that are feeding into that, I suppose, in terms of that factor of outbound travel. What's really interesting as well, and Corinne kind of touched on this in the international side, is that we're trying to also balance out, well, if we're having a lot of, say, outbound travel to Vietnam, is that stifling our inbound travel from these markets too? So there's arguments kind of both ways on that. But it could be also that if we are hitting a destination more, greater aviation capacity, is that going to also then have that market become a stronger one for us internally? And, is it going to be is that threat, say, going to be offset by internationals from other markets or that market too? In terms of, is there a balance that we're striving for? There, we haven't set a particular goal or a target in terms of what is that net outbound travel level. It's pretty interesting to see where it is. So back from 2015 through to 2019, it sort of hovered around like the 1.8 million travelers is the gap. And now, as we forecast going forward, it's going to be closer to about 3.9 million in terms of outbound versus inbound. So this is a new norm. I think comparing back to the, say, like 2017, 18 doesn't always make sense for a lot of these things. So to sort of determine where that gap is going to be a moving thing. But obviously, for Australian tourism, we do want to have more of the internationals coming here to visit as well.
Great, thank you, Garrett. The next question, oh, it just popped up, is there any consideration for targeted economic analysis and forecasts on arts or cultural tourism, especially as we lead into Brisbane 2032 and the Cultural Olympiad?
Can I jump into that one?
Yes.
Yeah, great question. Love it. So in terms of, are we going to be doing specific analysis getting into, arts tourism, cultural tourism, and major global events? So there's a few things that tie in with that. I guess firstly is, and if you haven't heard of this or looked into it, do Google the Golden Green Decade. So our friends over at Tourism Australia are doing a lot of work around this, and there's so many awesome, massive events coming this year alone. There's several, and right up into the lead up till 2032, this huge number of events that are a focus area. In terms of doing some targeted economic analysis and forecasts on specific areas, so we are doing more and more of that in TRA, as hopefully some of you would have seen in recent years. So last year, for example, we've been able to kind of hone in on a few key areas and produce bespoke reports to really give the official stats and information for those areas. And we're looking to do more of that this year and going forward. So last year, we produced the Agritourism in Australia report, accessible and inclusive tourism, cycle tourism as well, to name a few. In terms of what we're looking to focus at next, in terms of doing a bit of an understanding around what goes on in specific sectors, there's several that get suggested to us, and several that we're interested in looking into when we look at trends and the data as well. So it's probably a bit more of a watch this space. Arts and cultural tourism is on that list as well, but so are a number of other things, and there's a bunch of other factors and events that influence that list in terms of the bespoke reports that we get to do. But yeah, we like doing them, and it's good to have that extra detail into a sector when we're playing in the tourism space too.
Great, thank you, Garrett. There are two further questions that we can, three further questions we can quickly try and answer now, but also just to let you know, if you do write your question in, we can later, or like after the close of this, I can write you back responses. So you can, if you keep your Slido open, we'll answer anything we don't get to now. But Garrett, maybe you want to answer this question as well. Has there been any developments in capturing arrivals data from inbound cruise travelers?
I would have to check in with our surveys team around that. So in terms of the capturing data for international visitors, that's run through our international visitor survey. Mostly it's historically been conducted at the airports, and that's how we get that data. But we also pull into that the OAD ABS data. So that's the overseas arrivals and departures data as well. And we look at a few other sources too. So particularly when we're doing things like these forecasting reports, we're looking at an absolute stack of different data sources for this too. So in terms of other developments in capturing arrival data from inbound cruise travelers, I would have to check and get back to you on that one, unfortunately. Don't quite know at this stage. But yeah, we're always looking at evolving how we get data to make it more granular, more actionable, and more insightful for the industry too.
Great. Thank you very much. We're actually at time, Garrett. Should we call it? There's still some more questions. As I said, I can answer them in written form.
Probably, yeah, look, let's give very short answers. I can
Okay.
see two of them. So why don't I
Okay.
take the first one and I'll quickly do that, and then you do the other one. We would promise be no more than 5 minutes. So
Oh, okay.
such strong growth from Asian markets. And Corinne, you probably have more to add to this, but I think there's a few interesting factors that come across here. So one is that even a hangover that we're still seeing from the pandemic side is that there is more interest in short haul international travel than there is long haul. So that's why we're seeing particular growth in some of those Asian markets. However, when we look at as well global economic country level forecasts and situations too, we're also seeing things like rising middle and upper classes in some of these areas. India is a fantastic example of this. The discretionary income increase in countries like India and Vietnam is on the rise, which is why they are areas of focus. Tourism Australia added Vietnam to its list of countries of focus last year for this factor and others as well. So in terms of why we're seeing such strong growth from there, short haul, growth in discretionary income, connectivity from airlines as well being a factor there. Corinne, anything to add to that before you jump into the last question?
Yeah, no, just yeah, strong population growth as well as economic growth there. Um, yeah, and our ties to those countries. So a lot of our
Good
population
point.
comes from there, and yeah, very aspirational. Australia is a very aspirational destination for some of those countries. Thank you, Garrett. Okay, so next one, you mentioned international spend was impacted by longer stays of working holiday makers. However, after 12 months, don't they lose their status as tourists? Because tourists are traveling for less than a year. So you're right, we capture spend short-term visitors, so visitors in Australia for less than 12 months, or that's 12 months in Australia without leaving and coming back. So some working holiday makers may do that. But I was specifically mentioning that there were more working holiday makers in Australia. So there was an expanded eligibility to be a working holiday maker. So we saw a lot more working holiday makers come to Australia. And in general, working holiday makers stay in Australia for a long time, longer than your average just pure holiday traveler. And so they're contributing to this longer stay and higher spend. So I hope that answers your question. And Garrett, there was one more that jumped in after you started. Is that okay?
Sneaky. Yeah,
This
okay.
is what have been the drivers in domestic overnight trips from 2019 to 2025, going from 70 to 109 million trips is very high, way above population growth. Is it the economy and not going overseas?
Just having a look at the data for that. So basic overnight trips. So I think we saw that was, yeah, back in 2020. So that was during the pandemic where we couldn't really travel. That was when it was at its lowest there at 84 million. The year before was the last full read, I guess, would say. It was also 2019, the highest ever previously number of domestic overnight trips. So really, it's more about the recovery from the pandemic there. So by 2022, we're back to that level. And then we've seen, as you can see there with the figures, pretty steady numbers for 2023, 2024, and 2025. With that growth, as I talked about, sort of picking up in the later years. So it's probably less that there's been massive growth. I mean, technically, yes, because we're all locked down, particularly those unfortunately in Melbourne. And then we were allowed to go travel again. And then we were able to head off and out. So that's probably more where that comes from. Oh,
Thank you
last
very
question,
much.
Corinne, your lovely
My
background, and then we should
background.
sign off.
Yes, this is near where I live. This is from Cleveland in southeast Queensland, south of Brisbane. It is the Raby Bay foreshore, just near where the Cleveland train pulls in. If ever you want to travel over to Stradbroke Island, you will probably pull up here and then catch a bus out to the Stradbroke ferry. Yes, it is lovely. Thank you. And so that is it for our webinar today. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much for all your questions. As I said, if you do want to send some more through, we can answer them. We also have other ways to contact us. Hopefully you've got the QR codes, the websites and things like that. Please reach out if we can give you more information. But yes, thank you so much for your involvement and for being here today.
Wonderful. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.